My dear Delta sisters and colleagues, I am Dr. Cynthia Gooch Grayson, the chair of the National Heritage and Archives Committee for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. The National Heritage and Archives Committee extends gratitude to our international president, Elsie Cook Holmes, for her steadfast support in preserving our beloved heritage. I am honored to welcome you to a special presentation featuring Dr. Thelma T. Daley, the 16th National President of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, and Mrs. Patricia Wirth, the Executive Director of the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial in Lorton, Virginia. Delta Sigma Theta's first public act of service was our participation in the Suffrage March of 1913, just months after 22 young, courageous college women founded our organization. We are proud of our involvement to this significant historical event and remain committed to preserving the memory and legacy of the suffrage movement. We are grateful for Dr. Daley and Mrs. Wirth's collaboration and are thrilled to provide this unique opportunity for our members and friends. This presentation will offer a deeper understanding of the contributions of Deltas and women from all over the country to the suffrage movement, a chance to delve into our shared history and celebrate the progress we've made. We hope you will find this presentation enlightening and informative, and we appreciate your participation. Thank you for viewing.
Well, Mrs. Wirth, I'm excited too that you're on. And she mentioned our national president, Ms. Elsie Cook Holmes, and I think you know her. Don't you know her?
Yes, I do. I had the pleasure of meeting her. She and some other past presidents of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority came to our memorial, and it was a lovely gathering. Unfortunately, we had a little rain, but that didn't stop anybody because everybody had either their red raincoats or their red umbrellas with them. And they got to take a tour of the memorial and see our statue of Mary Church Terrell and learn a little bit about the memorial firsthand.
Yeah, and when you mention that, let me just say, Sarah Gwendolyn Boyd has visited, Sarah Louise Rice has visited, Cynthia McIntyre has visited, and Sarah Beverly Smith, and Sarah Paulette Walker. All have visited. But I know that the focus is going to be on the National Turning Point Memorial that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I thought you and I could begin with just some capsules, some tidbits about the suffrage movement. But then I really, really, really want to focus on the memorial, all right? But I think it's very significant to go back to say that the whole movement, I think, started in 1848. Would you agree with that?
I would definitely agree that the formal movement, the formal movement of the suffrage movement did indeed take place in Seneca Falls in 1948, but from 1948 to 1920. But the truth of the matter is there were women that were looking to become enfranchised way, way back. And that goes all the way back to the Adams couple were writing letters to each other. And she said, don't forget the ladies, when he went off to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And unfortunately, the ladies got forgotten in both the Declaration of Independence and eventually the Constitution. So there was a big gap there, but most certainly I do agree with you, Dr. Daley, that things really got going. And because the Seneca Falls Convention resulted in a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, and it was reduced to writing. It was because it was in writing that we really look at that as the very beginning of the formal suffrage movement.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's very interesting because most people put Susan B. Anthony there first, but the two who led that movement at Seneca Falls were Lucretia Mott and
Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Yeah, and the two of them actually, there's a backstory to how they met. In 1840, the two of them had been delegates to a international anti-slavery convention in London. And they didn't know each other beforehand, but they met there, and they were official representatives of the United States. And when they got there, all ready, and they had all of their, notes and so forth, and were ready to participate, they were told that because they were women, they could not participate. Not only that, they could not even sit in the room with the delegates. They put a curtain up, and they were told they needed to sit behind the curtain and not to say a word, or they would be removed from the whole event. So they had traveled all the way across the ocean to participate in this convention, and they were told that they could not do that. So they never quite forgot that. And it was 8 years later when they convened the Seneca Falls Convention for Women's Rights.
Mm-hmm. And I think people may not realize it, but in the struggle, women were not always treated in a very nice way. I mean, I think they were abused and scorned and whatever. Would you agree with that? I wonder if we had been there, how would we have come out looking from all of this?
Well, I totally agree with you. And it's interesting that you posed the question that way, because when I first got involved in this project, I personally didn't know anything about the suffrage movement because I had never learned about it in school. And when I do presentations around the country, I can tell you it's 99.999% of people don't know anything about it. And I was certainly one of them. And so I kind of went into the project thinking, about women of today and who we are today and how we do things today. And then there were the women of yesteryear who were working on this. But what I came to realize over the years that I've been involved in this project is that those women were no different than we were, or we are. I mean, they were exactly the same. They had families, they had illnesses, they cared about their children. And they began to understand that they were being suppressed for education. They couldn't be educated. There was a whole host of things. But at the end of the day, what I came to realize is they were absolutely no different than we are today. It was just their tools that they had to be able to express themselves and make a difference was very different. They toward the end of the movement, they did have telephones, but other than that, the ladies were meeting in each other's homes. They were having teas. They were sending letters, prolific letter writers. And that's how they communicated. And so, it's not like you could send a text and 8 million people would find it. So it was a long process.
Some of them are riding in horses and buggies and carts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I understand also, that Susan B. Anthony attempted to vote in New York, in Rochester, New York, and was arrested and treated in a very bad way.
My understanding is when they did arrest her at the polling place, they actually knocked her to the ground and hauled her off to the judge's chambers. And when she had her trial, she was convicted of unlawfully voting. And she was fined, and she never paid that fine. Mm-hmm. However, in 2020, there was a women's suffrage centennial organization that was put together to celebrate the 100-year anniversary. And they were meeting with the president in the Oval Office. And he presented a proclamation where he pardoned her for that crime that she had committed.
Oh, that crime.
That crime that she had committed.
That crime. that crime in there. You mentioned something about organizations, and I know for myself that I belong to 2 or 3 organizations, and I also know that sometimes organizations change names. In fact, my professional organization changed names about 3 times. But there were some organizations that didn't quite get along, but some of them merged in some way, and a couple of them came out to be the two major organizations. You have any comments on that kind of a movement?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you that that's exactly what happened. There were various suffrage organizations that were formed by white women. There was only one that I know of that invited African American women and men to belong. Partially, the reason for the variety of organizations was, I think, geographic, because people lived in different places, and sometimes you seem to be able to accomplish a lot more when you can do things face to face. So, and so there were organizations that formed, and some of them merged, and some of them went out of existence altogether. But at the turn of the 20th century, there were two major organizations that were getting the amendment passed. And that was the one headed by Carrie Chapman Catt, and she took over the National American Women's Suffrage Association from Susan B. Anthony. And there was a young woman by the name of Alice Paul who had joined that organization. And then she and Lucy Burns, who was another member of the organization, moved to Washington on behalf of that organization.
Those were the two who went to Great Britain, didn't they?
Yes, they did. That's where they actually met. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's where they met. Alice was finishing her education, as some wealthy young American women did at that time. They went off to Europe to finish their education, and they got involved with the British movement for suffrage. The women there were called suffragettes, and that was really a pejorative term that was coined by journalists there to basically say they're not they're not a big deal. Don't pay a lot of attention to them. They're just troublemakers, and they did engage.
Militant. They were considered to be militant, weren't they?
Yes, they were, and they did instigate violent acts. I mean, they set fires, they broke windows, they put bombs in mailboxes. So they did actually get involved in some violence. And when Lucy and Alice returned to the United States and they joined Carrie Chapman Catt and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they felt that it would be good to have a presence in Washington. And so there was something called the Congressional Union that was a part of that organization that went to Washington. And they were doing very well, and they were raising money, and Carrie Chapman Catt wanted that money. And Alice and Lucy looked at each other and said, we can really use that money here. And they decided to break away from that organization, and they established the National Woman's Party. And Alice was, the age difference between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice was kind of mother-daughter, two different generations, and their thinking was just not the same at all. Carrie Chapman Catt's approach to women getting the vote initially was to do it state by state. And in fact, she was successful in that in 1920, there were 15 states west of the Mississippi River that did allow women to vote. The problem was it wasn't consistent. They all couldn't vote for everything. In some instances, they could vote for the president of the United States. In some instances, they might be able to vote for the school board, and that was it. So it wasn't consistent. But nonetheless, there were 15 states that did allow women at some level to vote.
Colorado was the first one to enfranchise women to vote, I think, from what I found out.
I think that's exactly right. It's a good thing that happened, and we'll get kind of go around a circle back to that, why that was. Whereas Alice's approach was singular. It was, we must have an amendment to the Constitution. That was her singular focus. Mm-hmm. And the two of them just never got along. They just didn't agree on anything. So, Alice had learned the militant way of doing things from her time in England, working with the Pankhurst family. But there was no violence perpetrated by any American suffragists. Rather, there was violence that was perpetrated against them in 1917, which we will get to.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I just want to go briefly to 19 and 13 and just say something about 19 and 13. And that was a parade organized by Alice Paul. But what was it like? Was it smooth? Was it comfortable? Did everybody welcome them? Did they have a good time walking down Pennsylvania Avenue? Did they indeed?
And I think not. They did not.
Of how they were treated?
I mean, it was the first big public event that the National Women's Party planned to hold. And it was going to be the first women's rights parade in Washington, D.C. There had been some parades in New York and Boston, but this was the first one in Washington, D.C. And Alice was a very brilliant young woman. And in fact, when she eventually passed in 1977, she had 6 college degrees, because if she didn't know something, she'd go back to college and get a degree. I mean, she left no stone unturned. So she very strategically planned this event on March 3rd, 1913, which was the day before the inauguration of President Woodrow Wilson.
Was that respectful?
Well, when the train pulled into Union Station and President-elect Wilson got out, he goes, "Where is everybody?" And the answer to that is they're all down on Pennsylvania Avenue because there's a parade going on.
With the women.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what happened after that is Pennsylvania Avenue, if anybody has been there and visited there, it's a very wide avenue. And you can probably easily walk 12 or 14 abreast down the avenue. Because of the inauguration, there were over 500,000, predominantly men, who had come to Washington to be there for the inauguration. Well, what do you suppose they were doing while they were waiting?
A lot of them were drinking and having a good time and learning curves and do all those things.
Yes, and as the women progressed, and there were about between approximately 6,000 women who had come from all over to participate in this parade, they started getting rowdy and nasty and started calling the women names and throwing things at them and moving in on them and ripping their clothes. And eventually, by the end of that melee, there were over 100 women that were taken to the hospital. They had to call in the cavalry from Fort Myer, which was across the river in Virginia, to come in and stop that. But the women did not stop the parade. They wound up finishing the parade single file because they were deterred. They were absolutely going to finish that parade, and they did.
And we in Delta know that our founders also marched in that parade, and it was because Mary Church Terrell interceded with Inez Milholland for them to march in the parade. But I want to go to 2 things for 1917. I just want to throw out, before you get to November 1917, I just want to go back just to throw in the point that in April of 1917, Jeanette Rankins of Montana became the first female in the House of Representatives in the United States of America. And I'm not going to talk about that, but I just wanted to throw that in. But I also want to say that the women picket every day, round and round, that they not, whether it was cold or hot or what, they were picketing. I have been out, I don't think I've been out picketing, but I've been out in front of the Supreme Court holding up signs for different things. And so I guess you would call that protest, but not picketing. But nobody was mean to me. Nobody put me in jail. And I didn't have to. I understand that there was a fellow there who kept the irons hot so the women could stand on it to warm their feet because it was so cold. So what did they call these marchers, these women who kept going marching every day, no matter what happened?
They were called the Silent Sentinels. But if I may, I would like to talk a little bit about the lead up to picketing the White House. Mm-hmm. One of the National Women's Party's leaders was, as you earlier mentioned, Inez Milholland. Mm-hmm. And she was beloved by the members. And she was a great lawyer. She was a great orator. She was from New York State. She and her father were both members of the NAACP. And she carried a lot of weight, and she was highly, highly respected. Alice sent her in a contingent by train out west to be talking about suffrage, talking about getting an amendment, that sort of thing. And when she and her sister actually traveled together there. And when they were in Los Angeles in November of 1916, right, Inez was giving a speech in Los Angeles, and she collapsed on the stage. They took her to the hospital, and she succumbed 2 weeks later. She was 30 years old, and she became the martyr for the suffrage movement. And her wake was held in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. on Christmas Day, December 25th, 1916. And I can tell you that the National Women's Party was devastated beyond belief. Many, many, many hundreds of members came from all over the country to pay their final respects to her. And so Alice asked for a meeting with President Wilson, and it was granted. And she and several dozen members went in to meet with President Wilson. And she said, President Wilson, people are dying. You need to do something about suffrage for women. And his position was, number one, he really didn't want women to get the vote. He didn't think it was necessary. But his pat answer to that was, well, that's a state issue. That's a state issue. There's nothing I can do. Well, there was something that Alice could do. And on January 6th, 1917 was when they began picketing the White House.
And do you recall those last words of Inez Milholland that she uttered, a message to the president? Can you recall those words?
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?
Yes, how long must women wait for liberty? And even though I can say today, we are still waiting for full liberty. We are still waiting for full liberty. Okay, but I want to get to the memorial, but anything you want to say to lead up to what the memorial represents and all of that? Do you want to talk about the night of terror of November 14th of 1917 a little bit?
I will certainly do that, but the women started picketing in January of 1917. And they were called the Silent Sentinels because they were silent. They just kind of backed up to the fence that went around there.
Walking around, yes.
That's right. And they were very respectful. They didn't cause any trouble. But President Wilson at that point had been reelected, and his promise had been that he would not get America involved in World War I.
When did he get a new wife? When did his wife? He had a new wife. He had to remarry.
Yeah, his first wife passed, and she was not in favor of suffrage, and his second wife was not in favor of suffrage either. I think her name was Edith. Their signage got rather distasteful when they were picketing, And they didn't have kind things to say about President Wilson, and they started calling him Kaiser Wilson. Mm-hmm. At that time, Carrie Chapman Catt and her organization stood down out of respect for the war. Alice Paul's organization said, we are sending our American boys to fight for democracy in Germany for the German people. But what about democracy for women in the United States? And so they didn't stand down. They kept picketing. And in June of 1917, President Wilson started having the women who were picketing arrested. There were two jails. There was one in two DC jails. One was in DC proper, and the other one was in Lorton, Virginia, at the Occoquan Workhouse. And the majority of women were sent there. And so that's they started. Women were given the choice. They were arrested. They were taken to court, and they could pay a fine. And most of the women said, "I'm not paying a fine because I did not break the law." They were arrested on the trumped-up charge of obstructing traffic on the sidewalk, which there's no such ordinance. It was just made up, and he just wanted to get rid of them because they had had enough. And it was deplorable conditions under which these women were kept. They were given urine-soaked mattresses, vomit-encrusted blankets. The food and porridge that they were given were crawling with maggots. They asked to be treated as political prisoners, but they were not. They were treated as criminals. Their clothing was taken away. They were unable to contact their lawyers. It was very horrific. And Lucy Burns was arrested because she picketed. Alice, they didn't want her picketing because she was the head of the group, so they kind of kept her off the picket lines. But Lucy was arrested, and she spent over 7 months in the Occoquan Workhouse for picketing.
And I just want to throw in that a moment there, even though Mary Church Terrell was picketing, for some reason, she was never there to be arrested, which I am glad, because I believe she would have been treated differently if you could get worse. Mm-hmm.
Well, you're absolutely, yes. I mean, most of the women who were jailed at the prison were African-American women, and the majority, if not all, of the guards, the female guards for the female prisoners were African-American, and they were encouraged, the guards were encouraged to be very rough and nasty with the suffragist women who had been jailed there. And so it wasn't very good there either. I mean, the conditions were really, really horrible. That had Mary Church Terrell or her daughter Phyllis, who also Phyllis also picketed. Had they happened to have been there the day, one of the days. I mean, I don't know that they were arrested every single day, but they were, there was an ongoing arrests of these women. I don't know that it was every single day because they were there every single day. I think that would have been pretty awful. Those circumstances would have very much been egregious, for sure, even worse. Nice. On November 14th, a train came in from Washington with about 33 suffragists. And their quarters were not in the big brick prison. They were housed in a small wooden building across the street. And they were pretty much in Lorton. Yeah, we're in Lorton, Virginia. And the train came in, but the women were kept separately across the street in a separate building that was a wooden building, and they were housed primarily like a dormitory. They had cot after cot after cot, which is where the women were. And they came in and they asked to be treated as political prisoners. Well, the superintendent there, his name was Whitaker, had gone down to Quantico, and he had brought up a bunch of Marines. They were not in uniform. And he knew the number of women that were coming. So he had a lot of Marines there. And the women that had come in on that train were dragged across the street by two burly Marines, and they were thrown into punishment cells in the brick building where the men were housed. One woman was thrown into the cell, and back in the day, they used to have iron beds. The headboard and the footboard were iron, and one woman hit her head, and she was rendered unconscious, but her cellmate thought she was dead.
Was that Miss Nolan?
Yes.
55 years old.
Yes, and the woman that was her cellmate suffered a heart attack. These women, these 30-some women, 33 women, had been given no food or water for over 36 hours. They were now injured. Several of them had been injured and being dragged across the street. They were given no medical attention. And and this is something that's not clear. I've heard many different stories about how did this leak out? How did people find out about the Night of Terror? That's what it became known as, the Night of Terror.
I understand that Miss Nolan was released because she was the oldest one. Is that true?
She was released, I think, because of the medical situation. But the women that were on that train that night ranged in age from 19 to 73. Mm-hmm. So there was a big range of age. Doesn't really matter how old you are when you're getting beaten. Lucy Burns was over there, had been taken over there as well. And they hung her up by her arms on one of the doors. And they kept her there all night. She was almost dead in the morning from asphyxiation because she couldn't breathe. I mean, it was really bad. So there's a couple of different stories on how this leaked out. One is some of the guards talked to the media, and another is that some of the Marines did, because the Marines didn't, they thought they were doing something good. And they did not realize what was happening. I mean, they had been falsely led to think that they were helping with this situation, but they really, really weren't. So it was just a matter of a few days after that all of the women were released, because that hit headlines not only coast to coast in the United States, but it went across the pond to Europe, and it hit the papers all over Europe as well, that Night of Terror.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to fast forward and just say that the House passed it in May 1920. The Senate passed it in June of 1920, and it had to be ratified. And I thought the ratification was very interesting. When I looked last night, what was happening in the House in Tennessee, what they were doing to Justin Jones and saying he had violated the rules and couldn't speak anymore, and they moved to adjourn until January or something. But I think that, what did Tennessee do for us? What did Tennessee do? What did Tennessee do?
Well, we needed 36 states to ratify the amendment, but I would like to say that President Wilson, who had not been in favor of women getting the vote, 6 weeks after the Night of Terror, he addressed both houses of Congress and said, I've been thinking. And, and there's, during this war effort, for World War I, women have had to work in our factories, and women have gone to Europe and been nurses and so forth and so on. And I really think it would be a great idea, that we think about giving women the vote. 6 weeks later. And so, yes, it wasn't until June 4th, 1919 that Congress passed the amendment and had to go to 36 states. So 35 states had ratified, and we get to Tennessee in August of 1920. Anybody and everybody who was anybody that cared about this was in Nashville. Harry Chapman Catt was there with a whole entourage, Alice remained in Washington because, unlike Carrie had a member of her organization that passed and left her millions and millions of dollars, and I believe it was $20 million to run her organization. Alice was not so lucky. Alice was, they weren't as large and they didn't have as much money. So Alice was there, working the phone, still trying to raise money, because isn't that what we do for any political anything? We're always raising money. So there were, in addition to, there were also the antis. There were a lot of women that didn't think women.
That's anti the vote.
Yes, they were anti-suffrage. It's like, I don't need to vote. My husband can vote for me. My son can vote for me. I'm living here on my pedestal and I don't need to go, dirty my hands and go vote kind of thing. So there were, the anti-suffragists were there. And there were also manufacturing companies there and liquor companies were there. So, and they were against women getting the vote. The prohibition had already been passed, but they were afraid that women would continue to want prohibition forever because, husbands would become inebriated and, beat their wives. And so that was one of the reasons. The manufacturers were there because they were using child labor, and they were afraid that if women got the vote, that they would start a movement so that there would not be child labor, and they were right about that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, there was just a whole bunch of stuff going on. It was like a madhouse, and eventually they had to go to chambers and they had to vote. And if you were in favor of the amendment, the men walked in wearing a yellow rose.
And I saw a red rose. So what would that mean?
The red rose meant you did not want this to pass. No way, no how, you were wearing a red rose. Mm-hmm. And there was a young man by the name of Harry Burns. He was 24 years old, unmarried, and I've seen a picture of him. He was very cute.
A red rose.
Yes, he was. He was wearing a red rose. And so they started, and Alice's representatives were up in the balcony, and they're counting. And they called Alice. Alice, we don't have the vote. It's not going to happen. We don't have the vote. However, when they started taking the vote, going down the roster, and they get to Harry Burns, he kind of took off his red rose and he said, aye, and he voted in favor of it. And they went on down. And when they did the final count, the amendment passed by one vote. One vote. It was Harry Burns who made the difference. Now, the question is, why did Harry change his mind?
His mother got to him.
Yes, she did. She sent him a letter and she said, Harry, I've been watching what you're doing, but I really don't know how you're going to vote. But I think you ought to help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification. And that's exactly what he did. And I will tell you, they were a lot of his fellow legislators were not happy about this. And they sent the information off to Washington immediately. And and at that time, amendment was ratified by Tennessee on August 18th, 1920. But it had to go to Washington and be certified by the Secretary of State.
His last name was Colby, I believe.
And he was at home. Yes. And he knew that the last thing he wanted was to have Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul in the same room. And he also had been apprised that there was going to be people that were coming out of the woodwork to protest this. So at dark 30 in the morning, in his home, he silently by himself, he certified the 19th Amendment. When I do this presentation, I tell people there's two morals to that story. The first moral is always listen to your mother. And the second one, which I really bring home, is never, ever think that your one single vote doesn't matter. Do whatever you need to do to get to the polls, to go early, to get an absentee ballot, to do what, make sure you get a ride. Do whatever you need to do to vote, because every single vote matters.
And now you have captured all of this in your leadership with the Turning Point Suffrage Memorial in Occoquan. Could you tell us about the memorial? Could you really focus on the memorial for us?
I can. In 2018, the park manager's name was John Hauser, got to know people up at the workhouse. At this point, it was no longer a prison, and it had been turned into the Workhouse Arts Center. And as businesses, he got to know the people that ran it, and he learned about the women who had been incarcerated there. The Occoquan Regional Park was part of the historic prison grounds, and so it abuts where the prison is up on a hill. And so it was one big property at one time, but they carved out this piece to make it into a park, into Occoquan Regional Park. And so he started talking with people. He went to the League of Women Voters, because Carrie Chapman Catt took all of the offices that she had put together throughout the country, and she turned them into the League of Women Voters. So that was her legacy after the amendment had been passed. Alice Paul, who had always fought strictly for the amendment, what she did 3 years later, she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment, which still hasn't been certified. It's been passed by all of the states that needed to pass it, but it hasn't been certified yet. We're still waiting for equality for women in this country. We still are not in it under the Constitution. Anyway, a movement began, and the mission of the organization was all about education, to educate, inspire, and empower present and future generations to remain vigilant in the quest for equal rights. That's what this whole movement has always been about, was about educating people that over those 72 years, from 1848 until 1920, there were over 5 million women who were involved in the movement. They would put money in their coffee cans and their kitchen counters. They would save dimes and nickels, and they would send that in to do what needed to be done for enfranchisement.
And I just have to say that there were other deltas involved other than our founders. And I think I have pointed out before to the deltas that several of our honorary deltas were deeply involved, other than Mary Church Terrell.
That is correct. And in fact, we have always considered the deltas as one of our national organization partners. And we've always had your logo on our website as one of our national partners. I had met with President Walker at your headquarters, and was just humbled when I walked into the foyer and saw that picture of the 22 women that founded the Deltas. I mean, it was a very humbling experience. I will never forget that. And I wasn't sure if I was allowed to take a picture or not, but I did, because I had to have a picture. It was just like, wow. And that became possible. That meeting became possible because one of my closest friends happens to be a Delta. And I had been talking to her just in general terms about that march in 1913. And I mentioned the Deltas. She goes, well, I'm a Delta. And I said, really? And so that, my friend Dory Scott, so that is how that all began. She helped me be able to do that. And so, the Delta presence became very, very important. And we wanted that incorporated into the memorial. It's very important to us that be incorporated, the bits and pieces of the history be incorporated into the memorial. And I would also like to say that when the 19th Amendment was passed, it was the largest expansion of democracy in a single day that the world had ever seen. 25 million women got the right to vote. Mm-hmm. Now, you and I know that primarily white women got the vote.
Yeah, because the Black women had to go through poll taxes and taking the examinations and all of those things. Yes.
Right. As far as voting goes, it's up to the state what the laws are. And so we had the Jim Crow laws absolutely positively everywhere. So Native American women, Asian women, African American women, and Latino women, and men, there was subsequent legislation that had to occur for any of that to happen. And so we talk about all this in the memorial because we have 19 information stations that start way back with Abigail Adams and go all the way through to the present. And we talk about the subsequent legislation. We don't have this, I don't think we have this as part of the memorial, but I certainly have it as part of my talk whenever I do. And that is the gutting of that section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by the Supreme Court in 2013. And what we have seen as a result of that is we have seen state after state after state introduce legislation to suppress voting rights. It's like a stake through my heart, because when I worked all those years to see what occurred, what these women fought for, what they achieved, and to see that happen has been very, very, very difficult for me. But as the memorial was being built, and incorporation of the deltas was always part of it, we got money from the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. Well, we didn't get money. They actually bought 3 statues for us. That was part of their contribution. And so we have Alice Paul at the front of the memorial. We have a replica White House gates, and she's there holding a sign that says, "Mr. President, how much longer must women wait for liberty?" And then when you walk in, we have the section that are the women who were arrested in 1917 for picketing the White House. So we have a plaque for each of them, and there were 92 or 3 of them. So we have a whole wall that kind of looks like jail bars that we have their plaques up there. And directly across on this plaza is where we have our statue of Mary Church Terrell. And we felt that was an appropriate place because fortunately she was not up on the wall, but she was those were all the silent sentinels, and she was a silent sentinel. So that's why she was strategically placed there. And then when you walk in further, there's a rotunda, and we have Carrie Chapman Catt in the rotunda. So those were, 3 leaders that were incredibly important in the suffrage movement. I would like to say, because I think, we say that we are a national suffrage memorial, and indeed we are. We received funding from 45 states and the District of Columbia. Tens of thousands of people contributed. One that always touches my heart was a woman in Pittsburgh, and she sent me a letter. Well, she didn't send me a letter. She called me and she asked me some questions. We had a really lovely conversation. And a few days later, I received an envelope, and her return address was on there. And there was $1 in there. That was all she could afford. And I will never forget that. I mean, that was very meaningful to me, that she probably didn't get to eat or something because she sent that. Mm-hmm. But it was very, very meaningful. And of course, my blessed deltas, contributed $105,000, one of our top contributors. And we will forever be indebted to the deltas for doing that. And we have subsequently also hosted a wonderful Founders Day event at the memorial. A number of the local alumni associations had a big Founders Day event there. It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. And we have had Deltas come from all over the country. There's a legacy family of Deltas, a grandma, mom, and a daughter that are all Deltas that came from Texas to visit us. And so, I'm currently, what I do is I am the docent coordinator at the memorial, and we love to have people come and visit and give this story, because this memorial belongs to the Deltas and all of the organizations and individuals that contributed to make it a reality. It was a huge endeavor to be able to get the funds that we needed for this.
I just want to say that Delta was represented in the groundbreaking, which was November the 14th, 2019, and Delta was represented in the ribbon cutting when you opened the museum May 16, 2021. And I think Delta is also in a time capsule that was planted afterwards there. But before we close out, is there anything else, if you go there, that you can see? And the setting is so beautiful right there on the river, and one county on one side and one county on the other side. Any other highlights that you want to point up quickly that if you visit that you would see?
Yes, there is. And thank you for asking that question. The woman that was the chair of the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission was the second in charge of the Department of Interior. National Park Service is under the Department of Interior, and they take care of everything at the White House. And I had read in the Washington Post that they were going to take down part of the fence to build a higher fence. I mean, they do this every 10 years, I think. So people couldn't climb over the fence. And so I asked the chairwoman if it would be possible for us to get a piece of the historical fence that was there when the women picketed in 1917. Well, let's just say she made it her mission in life to get us a 36-foot section of the White House fence in which the women picketed.
The real fence, is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. And the National Park Service did a special information piece that tells what it is. And there's a picture of suffragists from New York State in raincoats that are picketing in front of that actual section of the fence. Mm. And so we take a lot of pictures there,
And for a minute, what was the role that the Girl Scouts played?
Well, when women got the vote in 1920, they were not allowed to bring their children into the polling places. And so the Girl Scouts of America volunteered to babysit so that mothers could go in and they could vote. And so one of the elements that we have in the memorial is a beautiful bridge that's behind the rotunda where Carrie Chapman Cat is. And we have Girl Scout troops from all over the area that come and do their crossing ceremonies where the girls cross to the next level. So we have Girl Scouts there all the time. And we love having our Girl Scouts because they're starting to learn this history very early. They may not get it in school, but they're getting it in other ways, because once again, the whole purpose of this project has been education, to educate people about this really important part of history that so many don't know anything. So thank you for asking.
Could you slowly give the official name of the memorial? What is it called?
The Turning Point Suffragist Memorial.
And where is it located?
In Lorton, Virginia. It is in Occoquan Regional Park. And the address is 9751 Ox Road, Lorton, Virginia, 22079.
Is it a place where children should go, like on those school trips?
Definitely. Now, I think middle school and up. I think that elementary school kids, it's not quite for them. But it is definitely, I think middle school and up can learn a lot. We would love to have school children come for sure. And we have other, women's organizations that have come from all over the country. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, AAUW, the League of Women Voters. We had people from, a group from California come. We've had a group that drove down from Michigan that came. So we've had people come from all over. And part of the memorial includes a donor wall. And so they get to see their name on there. They're very proud to have their name on that wall, to know that, every single donation made it possible. Every single donation. That little old lady up in, I don't know if she was old, but that little lady up in Pennsylvania and that dollar, boy, I'll tell you that, boy, I will never forget that. Mm-hmm. I will never forget that. Mm-hmm. That was important.
Yes. Should Deltas feel proud about the memorial?
Oh, I sure hope so. I mean, I'm proud to know the Deltas and what they have done, and and what they continue to do beyond, of course, way beyond the memorial, but just their involvement in so many important, very important things in which they every single day across the country, across the world, are helping, fight for civil rights and human rights and women's rights. And it means a lot to have the Deltas be a part of this, for sure.
Mrs. Patricia Wirth, you are a gem. And I think I said in my remarks in May of 2021 that we had become connected over this whole movement, but that we would be connected for life. Those were not the exact words, but I think those were the sentiments of that. Because not only were you connected to me because I was a Delta, but I think something about the synergy went together there. You are a wonderful leader, a wonderful person. And I am just delighted that you have shared this heritage moment for us, for Delta Sigma Theta, that will remain with Delta for years and years and years. And I hope the message will travel from chapter to chapter, from region to region. And now that we are in about 18 international countries, maybe across the Pacific and maybe across the Atlantic, who knows? Because technology has a way of carrying us there. So on behalf of the Heritage and Archives Committee, on behalf of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, I want to thank you for this superlative heritage moment.
Thank you, Dr. Daley. It's been my pleasure.